I'm very pleased that we are here this week for the ninth Iran Accountability Week sessions. As you know, the Foreign Affairs Committee had one set of panelists already last week, and we will be having two sessions, one today and one on Thursday. This is a tradition in the Canadian Parliament that started 9 years ago, started in 2012, and it's an opportunity, especially this year, given that it's been 40 years since the Iranian Revolution, to hold the regime to account. And traditionally, this is not a study. It is not something where we will be putting together recommendations. It is an opportunity for us to hear from people who have been human rights defenders, people who have been impacted about the human rights situation in Iran, and to hear about some of the brutality of that regime. So that is the purpose of these two meetings. And today, we will have two witnesses. We will have four on Thursday. Today's witnesses include Nader Hashemi, who is coming to us by video conference. He is director of the Center for Middle East Studies and professor at the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. Welcome, Nader Hashemi. And we also will have, although she has been slightly delayed, we'll have Shaparak Shajarizadeh, who is an Iranian activist who was prosecuted for peacefully protesting Iran's compulsory hijab law. And she was profiled by the BBC's 100 Most Influential and Inspiring Women of the World. And she will be with us shortly. However, what we will do is we will start with the testimony of Mr. Hashemi, and hopefully Ms. Shajarizadeh will arrive before he is completed. So if you'd like to go ahead for 8 minutes, Mr. Hashemi, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Is the sound coming through clearly? It is, okay. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, because I normally relish the opportunity at this moment to leave Donald Trump's America and to travel to some of the more civilized parts of the planet. But we're at the end of the academic quarter here, and so I'm glad that we can connect via teleconferencing. I'd like to highlight some aspects of the statement that I circulated in advance that I think is very germane to the concerns of the committee. But let me say something about the analytical approach that I take in my statement, my written statement, and my presentation. The analytical approach that I adopt is sort of a simple one, and it's an approach that I adopt to all human rights crises and all attempts to support human rights in other countries. And that's an approach that demands at the beginning that we be good listeners, that we don't presuppose to know what the best strategies are and what the best solutions are to support the work of human rights activists in other societies. In other words, the analytical approach that I take to the question of human rights in Iran is that we should listen and be guided by the courageous work of human rights defenders in Iran who are on the front line of the struggle, who are living in very difficult circumstances, and I think have a lot to share with us in terms of what they want from the international community, what they want from Canada, rather than us presupposing in advance that we know what is best for them. So I've studied actually quite closely the writings, the statements of many of these human rights defenders. I've interviewed some of them, and there is, I think, a broad consensus among many of these human rights defenders within Iran today in terms of what they want from the international community and Canada in particular. And I think these broad guidelines, or if you will, red lines, should be respected at a minimum. I think they should inform policy debate and deliberations in Canada with respect to the question of human rights. So I think the first broad consensus that exists among most human rights defenders in Iran is that they appreciate and deeply value having a global spotlight directed at Iran's human rights record. And they support the naming and the sanction, they support the naming, shaming, and sanctioning of individuals who are directly involved in human rights abuses. Now, I've heard recently that there's some debate in Canada criticizing the Canadian position for excessively focusing on human rights in Iran, but not on other countries in the region that have deplorable human rights records, in some cases worse than Iran. I think the response to that criticism is that Canada shouldn't roll back its criticism of Iran's human rights abuses, but it should actually elevate its criticism of other human rights abuses in other countries, many of which we have very close relations with. I think it would be a sad day, and human rights activists within Iran would be very disappointed if Canada withdrew its global spotlight on what's happening to them and to other human rights defenders in Iran today. The second broad point that I think most human rights defenders in Iran strongly support is widespread opposition and rejection to war, foreign-based regime change policies, and the military adventurism by the United States and its regional allies. In other words, a strong repudiation of the Trump-Bolton policy toward Iran, which seems that it's leading us to war today. The New York Times last night published a report that the United States is considering sending 120,000 troops to the Persian Gulf region. There's increasing hostility and rhetoric on both sides. There's been the recent sabotaging of commercial ships in the Gulf region. Iran has threatened to restart its uranium production if it doesn't get sanction relief from Europe. Europe has rejected that ultimatum. It looks like that we are witnessing the slow and steady spiral to another war in the Middle East with echoes from 2003. This clearly, I think, would be a calamity for human rights, not just in Iran, but throughout the broader Middle East. Human rights activists, I think, in Iran strongly and overwhelmingly oppose these political trends and recoil in horror at the prospects of another confrontation or a possible U.S.-Iran war. The third point that I think represents a broad consensus among human rights defenders is opposition to broad-based economic sanctions that affect the average Iranian citizen. Targeted sanctions that are directed at abusers of human rights and high regime officials with blood on their hands, I think, are generally welcomed by Iranian human rights defenders. With respect to sanctions, as a result of Trump's new hawkish policy, the effects on Iran's economy are predictable and they are catastrophic. Rising inflation, rising unemployment, a lot of deep despair. The IMF is predicting that Iran's economy next year will contract by 6%. These sanctions are driving millions of Iranian citizens into poverty and have significantly impacted the average person's access to medicine and healthcare. And let's be clear, it's the average Iranian citizen, not the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that have been most directly affected by these new U.S. sanctions. The focus and activity in Iran today among, for example, Iran's sizable youth population who yearn for political change is not on mobilizing to resist the policies of the Islamic Republic of Iran, but rather as a result of these new economic sanctions, the focus is on survival, economic survival, and if possible, immigration. Point number 4, I think there's broad support among Iranian human rights defenders for the Iranian nuclear accord, the JCPOA, because it averts and reduces the prospect of war, it removes economic sanctions, and it opens Iran's up to the international community. So in other words, I think there's a strong support for diplomacy to resolve tensions and to bring Iran into the international community, which could then open the door for more political possibilities to advance human rights activism in Iran and democratic activism as well. There's also, I think, a broad consensus, this is point number 5, among Iranian human rights activists, that a nonviolent strategy is the only way forward to improve the human rights crisis in Iran. This suggests patience. It's a long-term approach to advancing human rights and democracy. There's no quick fixes. Stated differently, the struggle for human rights and democracy in Iran is a marathon. It's not a sprint. There's a lot of understandable frustration among Iranians at the state of politics today, the state of human rights. There's a lot of desire for rapid political change. But if you're committed to a strategy of nonviolent resistance, one has to be committed to the long haul. All alternatives to a nonviolent strategy suggest war and suggest a situation that will make the human rights crisis much worse. And I think number 6, these are the last 2 points that I have. I think the international community should give recognition, name recognition to the courageous work of Iranian human rights defenders within Iran, especially those who are in prison. There are many key figures, many prominent names, such as the courageous human rights activist and lawyer Nasrin Sotoudeh, her husband Reza Khandan, Abdul Fattah Soltani, Abdullah Momini, Mustafa Tajzadeh, Narges Mohammadi, Ismail Bakhshi, Sepite Golian. These are names that should become household names, not just in Canada, but around the world, because when the international community recognizes these names, puts these names into the public discussion, it makes it much more difficult for the Iranian regime to oppress these people. It gives them a certain sort of, blanket of protection that if they're going to be abused, there will be international repercussions to Iran's behavior. So there's a Canadian connection here. We used to have this Center for Rights and Democracy in Montreal, and in 2006, that Canadian center gave its most prestigious human rights award, the John Humphreys Freedom Award, to an Iranian political dissident, Akbar Ganji. That elevated his work. It gave him money. It gave him a platform to speak from. It was, I think, a step in the right direction. Giving honorary citizenship, for example, to Iranian human rights defenders is a way of supporting and giving name recognition to these people. A few months ago, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, formally invited Nasrin Sotoudeh, the courageous human rights lawyer, to be part of the G7 Gender Advisory Council. This type of creative thinking, I think, should be rigorously pursued by Canada. It helps human rights defenders. It would be broadly welcomed. And let me just conclude with a few quick observations. I think the question of human rights in Iran directly matters for Canada for three main reasons. First, it's part of our core Canadian values that define us as a country. I think our moral standing in the world is a reflection and is based on our commitment and our recognition that Canada is a country that defends and supports human rights norms. And polling, I think, generally reflects in Canada Canadian support of human rights foreign policy that upholds and elevates human rights. Secondly, Canada has a stake in the human rights crisis in Iran today. 2 Iranian Canadians have been killed in Iranian jails, Zahra Kazemi and more recently, Kavus Sayed Emami. Dozens of other Canadian residents have either been held in jail, have been prevented from leaving, have been harassed. This gives the question of human rights in Iran a Canadian connection, and we have an interest in pursuing, human rights in Iran for that reason alone. And also, Canada is the size to a growing and sizable Iranian-Canadian community. There's deep differences among them in terms of what strategy Canada should pursue, but I think there's a broad consensus that most Iranian Canadians, support Canada's elevation of human rights in Iran and supports Canada sort of elevating the work of human rights and pro-democracy activists in Iran.
Thank you. Unfortunately, you're over your time, but hopefully we can get back to some of those points in the questions and answers. And we are
Thank you.
very, very pleased that we do have here present physically Ms. Shajarizadeh, who, as I mentioned previously, is an Iranian activist who had to flee Iran in 2018, now resides in Toronto, and she is here with us today. And she is one of BBC's 100 Women Initiative. So you have 8 minutes for your opening remarks. Ms. Shajarizadeh, go ahead.
Thank you so much. First of all, I want to thank you, the subcommittee, for inviting me here to testify about the human rights violations in Iran. And I'm so sorry for being late. My name is Shaparak Shajarizadeh. Many of you in this subcommittee may know my story, but for those who don't, let me begin by saying that I'm not a professor, I'm not a historian. What I am is a living, breathing example of the human rights situation in Iran. I'm the mother of a young boy and an ordinary woman thrown into an extraordinary situation. I'm not a professional activist. I never began any movement. But when I was arrested, all that changed for me. When I was stripped naked and searched and thrown into solitary confinement, all of that changed for me. When I was imprisoned and told that I would never see my son again, all of that changed for me. I'm now a former political prisoner, but in many ways, I'm still a prisoner of the Iranian government. 2 years ago, I began protesting the forced veiling of women in Iran. For the past 40 years, Iranian women have been subjected to coercive measures to try and make them cover their hair and their bodies. Women's bodies have been made into battleground. Iranian women do not have the most basic right to decide for themselves what to wear every day. My act of civil disobedience consisted of me joining other women in Iran who were placing white scarves at the end of sticks and waving them in the streets. The woman who instigated that peaceful act, Vida Movahedi, is still in prison in Iran. Scores of women were arrested for this act of civil disobedience, and many are still in prison or awaiting trial. Before I got arrested in Iran, I would only hear about the brutality of the regime from people or read about it. But when I got arrested, all of those stories came to life for me. The first night of my detention, I was sent to jail in Wozara detention cells. I was forced to get naked and told to repeatedly stand and sit down over and over again. During the interrogations, I was beaten up badly and forced to endure abusive sexual comments and told that I was a spy for foreign countries and the CIA. I was arrested a total of 3 times and called to Evin prison for questioning and sent to jail twice in 3 months. The first time, even though I had made bail, I was sent to solitary confinement for a week. After being on a hunger strike for 5 days, I was released on bail. The second time I was arrested, they also arrested my husband. Although he had not done anything, in their eyes, he was guilty too, because he was failing at his job of controlling his wife. A sentence they said to him over and over again. You see, when they arrest or detain you, they also terrorize your family. When I was arrested for the 3rd time, they did so when I was with my 9-year-old son. He was with me in interrogations for 6 hours. They handcuffed me in front of him while he was screaming and begging them to let us go home. I was sentenced to 2 years in prison in addition to an 18 years suspended prison term. I knew that I had to leave. The only light I had when I was in prison was when I was finally allowed to see my lawyer, Nasrin Sotoudeh. She was recently sentenced to 38 years in prison and 180 years lashes. Nasrin Sotoudeh is one of Iran's most well-known human rights lawyers. This is the situation of human rights in Iran, a place where lawyers become prisoners. Nasrin Sotoudeh is still in Evin prison, the same prison that Canadian photojournalist Zahra Kazemi was tortured and murdered back in 2003. Sorry, Mr. Hashemi, I have the same names that you mentioned. The same prison that Canadian environmentalist Kavus Sayed Emami died in last year. His wife, Mariam Mombaini, had her passport confiscated as she was getting ready to board a plane with her 2 sons to British Columbia. She is still being held in the country against her will. Why shouldn't a Canadian citizen be allowed to join her 2 sons in British Columbia? Even prison is the same place that Canadian resident Saeed Malekpour has been in for the past decade. In fact, a dozen Canadians has been taken hostage by the Iranian regime in the past 15 years. How can a government just be allowed to keep taking other countries' citizens hostage over and over again? How can Canada even think of being diplomatic with such government that takes its citizen hostage? I feel a deep sense of guilt and obligation sitting in front of you here today. Guilt because I'm enjoying freedom in Canada others don't have. Obligation because I need to share stories of those we often don't hear from. The ones we don't, the ones who don't receive Nobel Prizes. I want to speak their names. When I was in prison, a woman named Mojgan Keshavarz began telling people about me and advocating on behalf of me. Because of that, she got arrested and charged with colluding the foreign enemies. She's currently in Qarchak prison. Yasaman Aryani and her mother, Monire Arabshahi, they were arrested because on International Women's Day this year, they were passing out flowers to other women on the subway to celebrate. They are charged with being a threat to national security. Atena Daemi, a young children's rights activist, spoke out against the killing of juveniles in the country. Iran is the largest executioner of juveniles in the world. On May 1st, 2019, Human Rights Watch reported Mehdi Sohrabifar and Amin Sedaqat were executed on April 25th, 2019. There were 15 when they were arrested and executed 2 years later at 17. Recently, the United Nations Secretary General reported that there were 160 child offenders on death row in Iran. These are the things that Atena Daemi was speaking out against, and she has been in jail for the past 4 years because of it. Sepide Qolian, 23-year-old student and journalist, arrested last November while reporting on labor rights protests. Aras Amiri, recently charged with working for British intelligence. Rezvane Mohammadi, charged with prompting same-sex relations. Arash Sadeghi, Narges Mohammadi, Ismail Bakhshi, the list is long and the charges ridiculous. Arash Sadeghi needs medical care. He has cancer inside prison, and the judge won't let him have the medical care he needs. And this is not just civil rights activists who are under attack. Environmentalists are also being detained. There are currently 8 well-known environmentalists being held in Evin prison for more than 400 days now. One of them, Nilufar Bayani, just turned 33 years old. She's former graduate of McGill University in Montreal. I ask the Canadian government recognize the work being done by human rights activists in Iran, not only by raising the issue at the United Nations, but by designating the Islamic Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organizations. There was a decision to do so back in June 2018, but we have seen no movement on this for almost a year now. What are you waiting for? The IRGC are the ones who are torturing Iranians, who are fighting for the most basic of rights that I have here in Canada. Canada can begin by sanctioning the individual architects of human rights violations and the judges who are the real criminals in the courtrooms. I want the people of my country to enjoy the same basic rights that I have in Canada. So sorry, just...
And you are over your time.
Okay.
If we could perhaps do some of that in the question and answer,
Okay.
Or you can always submit a written
Thank you so much.
testimony as well.
I just wanted to thank you.
Yes, thank you. So we will have time just for one round of questions, one for each, and we will begin with a 7-minute question for Mr. Sweet.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Sajariz Day, no one can imagine what you've gone through, and you're a courageous person. Thank you for continuing on your courage to try and defend those innocent citizens of Iran. We greatly appreciate it. Chair, I hope that all the names that have been named by our two witnesses so far will be in our statement for whenever we do that, so that we can do our part as in what is mentioned, making sure that they become household names. Mr. Hashemi, I wanted to say to you that this regime has been in place for 40 years. I did some research on your pedagogical style and challenging your students, particularly in regard to the book What Went Wrong. I read that some years ago. And I wanted to ask you in regards to your statement about being patient. For 40 years, this regime has been in place. They've had one of the most horrific human rights records that modern times have known. They export terror, and there's a significant link in that, in the sense that when you export terror, you contravene the human rights of people that are not on your shores. And this is well known. I'm certain that the people in Syria may have a little bit of a problem with being patient, as well as those in Yemen. So when you say being patient with this regime, and also Ms. Sharizade's comments about not being diplomatic, because those are the things that are in the minds of people in the West about the horrific treatment that they see. What exactly do you mean by being patient with them?
Patient with the regime. I didn't mean we should take the spotlight off of the Islamic Republic. I meant being patient with respect to the struggle for advancing human rights and democracy in Iran. That is a long-term struggle and has to be won in phases. I'm all in favor of shining the spotlight on human rights defenders in Iran, holding the regime to task. I'm very worried, though, at this moment, if you're following the news, that any sort of coercive military action by the United States could make the situation 100 times worse. So I think that's a serious danger that we have to be cognizant of. We have to push back against if we're serious about human rights. So that's essentially what I was talking about.
Okay. So are you in agreement then that the IRGC should be listed as a terrorist organization?
I have no problem with that. I'm not sure that's the biggest priority that we should be pursuing. If it can some way advance the struggle for human rights and democracy in Iran, I'm all in favor of it. My own gut sort of reaction to that suggestion is that there's other initiatives and policies that we can be pursuing and should be pursuing that are much more meaningful to people suffering in Iran today, particularly those in the prison system.
I think there's some other things we can do. I agree with you, but Ms. Sharizadeh specifically mentioned the IRGC, and I think those people who have been incarcerated, abused by the IRGC or the Besiege. I think just recently, the last December, I was reading that 5,000 people were incarcerated because of a protest, 25 people killed. These are IRGC and Besiege initiatives, and I think that would send a strong message. Are you familiar with the document that the Rahul Wallenberg organization published in regards to the names that should be identified under the Magnitsky Law so that they can be individually sanctioned?
I've seen that document before. I don't recall the specific names, but I'm strongly in favor of using the Magnitsky Act to sort of identify, to punish, and to penalize human rights defenders. I think that's something that most human rights defenders in Iran actually would welcome. And to the extent that Canada can sort of, I think, move in that direction, I think it would be a net gain for human rights in Iran.
You have 2 minutes.
I'll give the rest to Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Sweet. I wish I had a little bit more time. I guess, Mr. Hashemi, I'm a little bit surprised at your position on the IRGC, because they're the ones who oversee the human rights abuses. They're the ones who have been exporting terrorism around the world, in charge of wiping out religious minorities, and the international interference that they've been part of is expanding all the time. So I'm surprised to say that shouldn't be a priority of this government to list them. But I'd like to come back to our other witness and just ask you, there's a state orchestrated media campaign against you. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. Last week I had someone approach me and said that they have been threatened from Iran, the Canadian citizen in Ottawa here. IRGC took one of their relatives and told them to call Canada and tell her to stop her activism because that would make sure that, quote, no one got hurt. I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your the media campaign against you, and then have you been threatened in Canada since you came here?
Yeah, my family, as I told you, my husband arrested with me. He didn't do anything back then. When I came last December, I came here for a press conference to support Magnitsky sanction. After that, some officers went to my parents' house, and my mother was alone at that time, and asked them to come back later, but they didn't listen. They went to my house. They questioned my mom about me, about my husband, and specifically they asked lots of questions about my sister who lives in U.S. And they asked all the questions about when, how she went to live in U.S. That's why I'm very concerned that I asked her not to go back to our country, because she used to visit my family every year, but after that we are afraid that they got her hostage because they were asking lots of questions about my sister in U.S.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to Ms. Khalid for 7 minutes.
Well, I believe we're going to Mr. Levitt
Levitt
first.
Okay,
Thank you.
Mr. Levitt.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank both our witnesses. Ms. Sharizadeh, your bravery and courage. I've heard you tell your story a number of times, and each time I know that you inspire people and you raise awareness. And we had the pleasure of also having in the Foreign Affairs Committee last Thursday, Masih Alinejad, who again also spoke to us about White Wednesdays and the plight of women standing up in defense of their human rights, of their ability to be free. And I know it takes courage to be here. I know it's difficult, but we appreciate all of you that do this, including Dr. Ibadi, who also testified before us last week. I have the same question for both of you. What can we do as Canadians, as supporters of the Iranian people, to, one, let the Iranian people know we support them, two, help them achieve their aspirations to be free and to again have their human rights returned to them, their freedom, and C, hold accountable the abusers, given that after 40 years, the regime and its brutal enforcers, the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, refused to end the repression and change their behavior towards the Iranian people. What can we do here? What do you think helps? Maybe we can start with you, sir.
Well, my statement speaks directly to your question. And I'd just like to highlight I think the broad answer to your question is that if we really want to help the people of Iran to advance human rights and democracy, we should listen to them. And I think we should listen much more closely to them than to various political lobby groups who have a lot of influence in Canada and who I'd like to also mention tried to prevent me from being with you today. So I think that's important. We have to have our eye on the ball, listen to those people who are on the front lines, and be guided by their suggestions and their advice. And so I can go into more detail, but my statement speaks specifically to that question. If I could just highlight one concrete suggestion that Canada can pursue, and Ms. Shajarizadeh sort of, I think, alluded to this as well. Give honorary citizenship to courageous human rights defenders in Iran. One of the most prominent ones that has been mentioned in most of our testimonies today is the courageous human rights lawyer Nasrin Sotoudeh. She's been condemned to 38 years in jail. She has impeccable human rights credentials. I think by giving her honorary Canadian citizenship, it would make it much more difficult for the Iranian regime to keep her in prison. It will keep the spotlight on her situation. I don't think it would cost anything for the government of Canada to do this, and I think it would make a big difference. And it would send a signal that Canada is actually very serious about doing something about human rights, not just talking about it.
Thank you. And let me just point out that when we did testimony last week, as the previous 9 years that we've held Iran Accountability Week on Canadian Parliament, it is to hear from those voices, the voices of the repressed. And again, we had Dr. Shireen Ebadi, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, testifying before us last week, reaffirming loud and clear, as all the witnesses did that were before us, the need to continue to push for accountability, especially through both Magnitsky sanctions and the listing of the IRGC. So that is something that's been a clear message to Canadian parliamentarians, both in this committee and also in our Foreign Affairs Committee. Ms. Shireen Ezadeh, if we can have your thoughts, please.
I just have one question from Mr. Hashemi. I guess it's a great thing to give honorably citizenship to Nazrin Sotoudeh, but she's in jail. I can say all of the human rights activists right now are in jail. Most of our human rights lawyers are in jail, and the other one just keep silent because they're going to end up in jail. And we have other Canadian citizens. Saeed Malikpour is in jail. What can you do for him? He's the Canadian resident, and he's in jail. Niloufar Bayani is in jail, and they haven't give her even the accusation, the sentence. She's in, I don't know, she's in, she's detained in IRCG prison for more than a year. And she's not even facing the real accusation. The security, I don't know how to say it. The security department said they are not guilty of being a spy, but IRCG keep them in detention. What can we do for that citizen? I guess we have to be more severe toward human rights, architects of human rights violation.
Thank you. And I just want to do a follow-up question for you, ma'am. We heard, and I want to echo something that my colleague MP Sweet said, and that was we've heard about lobbies and proxies of the Iranian regime in Canada threatening human rights defenders, threatening people who are coming to committees like this or other places to tell their stories, to share them. Talk to us about that. Just tell us briefly, if you can, about the types of threats that the Iranian regime is able to place on Canadian shores here.
In 30 seconds.
Sorry. The day I had a press conference here, they spread a lie about me in here, and after that they went to my house. They said I was asking for sanctioning on the people of Iran. And that's why the officers went to my house. The Iranian-Canadian Council spreading lies about my action. This is what I witnessed about myself, and they have been doing it for a long time.
Thank you. Now for the final question to Ms. Hardcastle for 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It's always very difficult during Iran Accountability Week. We hear the emotion and we get frustrated and we have emotion, but we do know I'm a member of Parliament who's been here for one term. And I've been like you. I've been someone who's been following this issue as a Canadian, following what I think the mistakes are in our foreign policy and how we should be doing something. And so I do understand how words even are construed. I know this is a long game, we call it sometimes. There does have to be patience in terms of diplomacy, and you inspire us with your testimony. I've been to other groups of women who do the White Wednesdays, and that courage inspires me. So I just wanted to say thank you for that kind of inspiration and energy that you give all of us for all of our work in international human rights. We've had people come before this committee before, even General Romeo Dallaire with two fists on the desk and do something about the Rohingya. Do something, because he knows, he's lived it, and it gets us it gets us our frustration, our emotions. But with that, we have to take this logic and say, what is the government's role here? How do we use Canada's soft power? This committee has to discuss that. And so with the rest of my time, I'm actually going to ask your counterpart in testifying today, Mr. Hashimi, can you talk to us a little bit about that kind of frustration and how we're trying to help advance this capacity of Iran as brothers and sisters in the global world, and what Canada's role is? Because you just recently also experienced a vicious smear that went against another colleague that I had to ask to testify. And there are some very convoluted issues when we talk about threats, when we talk about lobbies and proxies. So would you talk a little bit about what is happening to you, maybe discuss the MEK and their mouthpiece organization in Canada, and how we should be cognizant of these things as we are taking our government role further? Excuse me, just use the rest of my time. I know my preamble probably took us to what, like 3? You got 3 minutes.
I find it very difficult to try and use the time that I've been allotted to address the MEK in the context of a discussion on human rights. They are irrelevant to the contemporary struggle for human rights and democracy in Iran. They're basically an extremist cult backed by a lot of Saudi and Emirati money and by a lot of powerful forces in Washington, D.C. with connections to John Bolton. So let's not get sidetracked by what they're trying to do in terms of manipulating this debate. I think getting back to what you said in your statement, the challenge here is how do we channel the legitimate frustration, the anger, and the concern that many Canadians have with respect to the human rights crisis into concrete action. And let me just tell you a story that I think applies perfectly to this debate. Yesterday, here in the city of Denver, the center that I direct at the University of Denver, the Center for Middle East Studies, hosted a former Iranian-Canadian political prisoner. You might have heard of her before. Her name is Huma Hodfar. She teaches at Concordia University. In 2016, she was on a visit to Iran, and she was arrested by the intelligence services of the IRGC. She came out of prison, and she told me exactly what happened that led to her freedom. The Prime Minister of Canada repeatedly spoke out and addressed the topic. Canadian civil society was mobilized and organized and protested in support of her defense. The Canadian Muslim community rallied, not just in Canada, but around the world, kept raising her name, put the spotlight on Canada. So I think if you just study and if you actually speak to Huma Hodfar, who's in Montreal, just down the road from where you guys are, relatively speaking, she can tell you what was happening in Evin prison and how she was managed to get out of Evin prison, because Canada took a very principled, a very focused position on identifying her case and demanding that Iran release her. So I think there's a lot more that we could be doing, that we should be doing. I think we shouldn't get distracted by these very powerful lobby groups who have no interest in human rights. They have their own narrow agenda. We have to listen to human rights defenders. And I think, Canada at this moment, I think at this very difficult moment in international relations, when democracies are declining and authoritarian populism is on the rise, the world is looking for Canadian leadership on this issue, not just with respect to human rights in Iran, but everywhere. Canada does have a lot of soft power. And what deeply disappoints me as a Canadian living in the United States is that I see a lot of Canadian politicians very timid to exercise that power, very reluctant to take risks and to provide the type of global leadership that I think human rights activists and defenders around the world would really support. And so I'd like to see more of that happening coming up from Canada, particularly given this very dark and very critical moment that the world is passing through. Canada has a lot to offer, and it's really disappointing to me as a Canadian to see that potential that Canada has not being realized.
So thank you very, very much. I'd like to thank both of our witnesses very much today, especially for your courage, Ms. Shajarizadeh, and thank you very much, Mr. Hashemi. And as you know, we will be having another hearing on this on Thursday at 1 o'clock. And with that, we are going to be going in camera momentarily for some committee business. So I'll ask that we suspend for a moment and that those who are not supposed to be here leave the room. Thank you.